David has a message for leaders, which I really like, so I'm going to make sure I read it verbatim. Every better business result requires creating better relationships. And every better relationship requires having better conversations. I missed something, right? Nope, I think that's it. And every better relationship requires having better conversations. So you're in for a great learning experience with David Lee.
Thank you. Good morning. So here's a question for you. What's the one conversation that if you had it and it went well would make the biggest difference in your life? What is that one conversation? And you can think about the workplace or in your personal life. Now, for many of you, you know instantly what that conversation is. And with others, it might not resonate with you. So I have a different question for you. What kinds of conversations do you find most anxiety producing? And because of that, you avoid them. What are those conversations? Maybe it's like for many people, it's the managing up conversation, giving your boss some feedback. Maybe they're a micromanager. Maybe you feel like they're not being respectful. How do you have that conversation? Maybe it's a conversation with a peer who doesn't hold themselves accountable, and you're wondering, like, how do I hold them accountable in a way that doesn't instantly trigger defensiveness? What are those conversations? And then the third question is this. In what ways would your organization operate better if people were willing to talk about what needs to be talked about, as opposed to avoiding bringing up the difficult issues and instead acting in passive-aggressive ways? What about if employees felt brave enough to have the conversations they need to have with their supervisor over those managerial moments of truth that I know you've had many throughout your career, those managerial moments of truth where your manager did something that left you just a little less excited about going to work. But instead of bringing it up because you didn't think it would go well, you became just a little less engaged. What about if employees in your organization felt empowered and confident in having those conversations? So I want that to sit with you as we explore together this material and to hopefully further your examination about your particular conversations. I want to share with you one of the most challenging conversations that I had. And I'll be revisiting this conversation throughout this morning. So this was with a bully coworker. And I was a new employee in this organization. And you know how when you're new, you're trying to figure out the lay of the land, like how do people relate, what are the unspoken rules? So that's how I am, and I'm watching how people interact, etc. And one of the things I noticed really early on was one of my fellow managers in team meetings, he would come out with these really off-the-wall, inappropriate comments. And they were at the maturity level of like a middle school boy. And I remember I must have looked like kids at the dinner table if their parents are arguing, because be at a meeting, he would say this really obnoxious, in-your-face comment to somebody, and then it'd be like, what are they going to do? And then, back and forth. Well, a couple months into working there, I got to be the recipient of his obnoxious behavior. And I don't remember the specifics. I think I sort of had like PTSD and blocked it out. But my vague recollection was he said something like, we were brainstorming, and I said, hey, what about we could do this? And I think he said something like, that idea stinks, and so do you. Okay. And I don't know if you can relate to this, but I have delayed intelligence. So, can come up with witty comebacks to just like hours or days, late. So I had nothing. That meeting was in the morning. I go back to my office. The rest of the day, do you think I'm focusing on my to-do list? No, definitely not. What do you think I'm doing?
Planning a comeback.
Yes, you got it, Denise. Planning a comeback. So I'm doing step one, and think about how you do your version of step one. I'm playing and replaying the movie over and over. And it's kind of like, no, like I could have done this or I should have done that. So I'm playing it over and over, getting myself more and more riled up. And we're going to talk about more of this later. But doing that self-righteous outrage, how dare he talk to me that way? Who does he think he is? Blah, blah, blah. Getting myself worked up. And then, as Denise points out, I start plotting my revenge. And you know how when you're really upset, you don't think clearly. I start thinking, okay, if he ever says that again, here's what I'll say. Like lightning strikes twice in the same place. And finally, I'm sure it took a couple of hours before I realized well, that's not going to happen. So then I start thinking, all right, I'll do a preemptive strike. I'll nail him with some, barb, some kind of put down so he gets never to mess with me again. Do you know how you do that? And you think about one of the things that's so funny when we do that, when we act in snarky ways with other people, do you think they're connecting the dots? Like if I do that 3 days later, he's like, oh, David's saying that because I said that. Therefore, I will never do that again. No, they just start plotting their revenge. And you think about in your organization or other organizations that you've worked, how much time and energy is wasted because of that, and how much could be saved if people were willing to have the conversation. So, I'm going through my tortured inner world about how dare he do that, what am I going to do to get him back, etc. And then it finally dawned on me a couple things. Number one was, I'll call him Sam. Sam's a pro at put-downs. I'm an amateur. I could spend hours crafting the perfect retort or put-down, and because he's so good at it, he could, right off the cuff, one-up me. And then I'm back to square one, and I've wasted all this time. So it's like, that's kind of dumb, number one. Number two, I started thinking about, I don't want to spend my time and energy thinking about how I can be obnoxious too. I didn't like being that way as a kid, like how to plot games and do the meanness back. I certainly don't enjoy it as an adult. I don't want to spend my time doing that. And then number three, I'm like, oh yeah, remember you teach and coach people about having direct conversations about issues? Like, oh yeah, right, there's that. So it's like, how can I encourage other people to have the conversation if I'm not willing to have the conversation? So now I'm at the point like, all right, I have to have this conversation. And what do I do? So later on, I'll share what I actually did. But in the meantime, here's what I want to ask you to do. With a partner or in a triad, what are conversations that need to happen in your organization and aren't? So these are 3 questions. Conversations you would love to feel more confident having. And then these sound hauntingly familiar. And number 3, if you're willing to share, what's the one conversation that would make the biggest difference in your life? Okay? So here's what I'm going to ask you. Let's do 5 minutes. And I'm going to do that clap thing. I guess it's called clapping. That's right. I will be clapping. And when you hear the clapping, if you can start clapping, and you know how it drowns out the people who are still talking. So we'll do that. And I'll give you a 30 second, okay, we're going to wrap up. So you can wrap up. So 5 minutes. Questions? All right, go. Let's awesome. Thank you very much. Let's hear just a few to get get the gears turning. Well, hopefully the gears are already turning, but you might hear something from the larger group that you hadn't thought of in your smaller group, and you want to oh yeah, I want to add that to my list of conversations. So how about this awesome group here? What one conversation that you all came up with?
Financial.
So financial conversation. So compensation conversations. Awesome. How about this?
We have the same situation that you have, the bully in the room.
The bully in the room.
Can't wait to hear how you
Can't wait to hear it. Awesome. The suspense is already. Okay. How about, however, this group was?
Yeah, we were speaking about just kind of crucial and tough conversations that managers and supervisors need to have with their staff.
So, challenging conversations that managers need to have with their staff. So, let's say giving feedback, perhaps. In fact, how about this for a fun fact? Research by the authors of the 2020 Workforce or 2020 Workplace, one of the two, what they found was the number one skill or competency that employees that were surveyed wanted from their manager was the ability to give candid feedback. And when managers were rated by HR professionals in their organization on these 8 skills, giving candid feedback was the bottom of the list. So huge, obviously huge need for getting better at that. And this is one of the reasons, actually I'll use that to launch into the backstory, and I'll keep the backstory brief. One of the reasons why I so love this material is because it's the term vicious cycle. There's also the virtuous cycle. And what I mean by that, as it relates to this, is the more skilled you are at having courageous conversations, the more hopeful you are that they will work, because you've got the skills, and because you're more hopeful they'll work, you actually have the conversation. And every time you have the conversation, you get better and better, so you have greater skills and more confidence. So it's that virtuous cycle of ever-increasing efficacy and happiness. Okay? Likewise, if your employees have these skills, then they're more willing to have the conversations with their teammates, with their manager, etc. So the backstory, just real briefly, how many of you are fairly conflict averse? Not real thrilled about conflict? Okay. Yeah. So I definitely can relate to that. Do not enjoy having conflict. Don't enjoy having courageous conversations. And I have them. And many times they're surprising how well they work out. Other times, not so much. And so, you know that saying that we teach what we most need to learn? That this has been a lifetime practice for me, both personally and professionally. So I bring that to our work together. And I want to share, and I share that with you because I remember years and years ago attending a conference conference presentation by the author of the book, How to Deal with People You Can't Stand, which is not a great book title. And he was phenomenal. But I found myself thinking, I can't imagine using the techniques that he's teaching because I don't have his personality. He was like super quick wit, super no delayed intelligence going with him. Instant comebacks galore. And so I share that with you. So for those of you conflict averse, those of you who also have the delayed intelligence, take heart that there is hope. You can use this. And actually, one of the things that finally dawned on me after all these years, there is a gift of not having the quick comeback. You think about what it is. You're much less likely to regret saying something in the heat of the moment when you have a flash of anger. And so we're going to talk about how to plan those conversations so you bring your best self into the conversation, and by doing that, help elicit the best self from the other person. So every better result you want requires a better conversation. I want you to keep that in mind. whether it's getting better customer service out of a team, whether it's having different teams working better together, whether it's your client or customer or patient-facing employees creating a better customer, patient, or client experience, requires having a better conversation. And then maybe the most important takeaway, at least for me, about why I care about these skills and getting good at this is the bigger picture, is that you can help make the world a better place one courageous conversation at a time. That you can have such a huge impact if you're willing to have these conversations. In fact, how many of you have had the experience like I have, that because you've been willing to kind of suck it up and have the conversation, it actually strengthened a friendship or a partner relationship? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 4 components. And how many of you either downloaded or glanced at the notes for this session? Okay, so just a few of you. There are fairly extensive notes, a handout for this. Also, though, those of you who want more in-depth materials to build on this, I'll share that with you in a little bit about articles on that. So here are the 4 components we're going to talk about. Number 1 is your story. What do you tell yourself about that person that you need to have the courageous conversation with? So with my coworker that we're calling Sam, the stories that I'm telling myself are, he's a bully, he's a jerk, he's doing this because he enjoys causing pain, and why wouldn't I have that as a story? So one of the things that we're going to dive into shortly is examining, what are you telling yourself about this person? Because what you tell yourself about them affects how you feel and how you think. Let me give you a quick example of the power of stories, the stories we tell ourselves. And it's not what happens, it's the story we tell ourselves about it. So when my daughter Jessie was about 2.5 or 3, I just want to check, people in the back, can you see me okay, or do I need to be on the stage? Can you see me okay? You're good? Okay, sweet, okay. Oh, hey, how you doing? So Jessie's about 2.5, 3 years old, and I'm about to put her into the car seat. All of a sudden, a teenage boy skates by on a skateboard. And Jessie looks up and she goes, "Hi, do you want to play with me?" Yeah, of course, he totally ignores her and skates on by. And being very fascinated with human nature, I was curious, what did she make of that? How did she make sense out of it? And my question was answered right away, because she looked at me and she goes, "Oh, Daddy, look at the boy, is shy. He doesn't talk." And I remember thinking, I hope when she gets to dating age, she has that same attitude. It's like, not about me, it's about him. And it's funny because I was doing a radio interview years ago, and I shared that story. And this lady called in and she said, I had my own version of Jessie's story. She said, I had just signed up for an online dating site where you don't show your pictures until after you and the other person agree. So you get to know each other and you share your pictures. And she said, this guy and I were having great conversation back and forth. We got to the picture sharing time, and then I never heard from him again. Yeah, oh. And she said, so I'm thinking, I guess he doesn't think I'm, attractive enough. And then she said, but then I started thinking, I don't know why. This is just a story I'm telling myself. She said, I know. Maybe he didn't respond to me because I'm too good looking for him. He thinks I'm out of his league. And she goes, and then I figured, well, since I'm just making it up anyways, might as well make it up in a way that feels good. Is that great? And we're just, whenever we tell a story about why somebody's doing something, we're just making it up. Sometimes we're right, a lot of times we're dead wrong. I mean, how many of you have ever gotten an email from somebody that you just knew they had an attitude? And then when you checked out with them, they're like, no, I was just rushing to a meeting and I just, tapped it out on my cell phone. So we're going to look at your story and how we can challenge counterproductive stories. Then we're going to talk about your state. the emotional state that we're in profoundly affects, number one, our ability to think clearly about how to have the conversation. So it affects our thought process. Also, you think about our emotional state affects how we interpret the situation. I was just talking with somebody recently who was convinced that she had gotten this really antagonistic email from somebody. And we did a lot of processing about how she should bring it up to this person. And then later, when she checked the email again, she said, I couldn't believe it. The email was fine. There was no antagonism there. She must have been in a negative emotional state when she read the email. And so if we're going to have a productive conversation with this person, we need to first challenge our counterproductive stories. Then we need to do the work to get into a positive emotional state. So we're in a frame of mind where not only are we not broadcasting, emotional contagion. Emotions are contagious. We're not broadcasting anger or fear or resentment. Instead, we're broadcasting calm, serenity, compassion, and that we're in a state that can engage the person in a productive conversation, not immediately trigger defensiveness. The third step is getting clear on our intention. What are we trying to accomplish here? Why are we having the conversation? And then last, but certainly not least, is our verbiage. What do we actually say? Now, if we just skip 1 through 3 and just go for the verbiage, it will not end well. It will not end well. The time spent doing the work ahead of time is time well spent. Okay, so let's talk about your story. So here's what I want to ask you to do. So I shared with you some of the things that I was telling myself about my coworker Sam. So I want to ask you to be thinking about one particular conversation, and especially if it's somebody that you've got some animosity toward, some anger toward. I want to ask you to think about what story are you telling yourself about this situation and this person. So with the Sam situation, I already shared with you what I was telling myself about Sam. About the situation, I started to scare myself. Because I started thinking, what about if I bring it up and he just says, like, oh, lighten up. That's just how I am. Like, don't be so sensitive. Like, now what? And so I created this whole horror show, my own little Stephen King, horror movie about what might happen if it goes, horribly wrong. So think about, when you think about having this conversation with this person, do you tell yourself like a doom and gloom story, not doom and gloom, like a terrorizing story about what can happen? Now, there's value in thinking about worst case scenario. That is really important in terms of strategizing. What we don't want to do, though, is convince ourselves that this horrible thing's going to happen and then get upset when it hasn't even happened yet. So there's a difference between the war gaming and strategizing versus what's called catastrophizing. So think about what are you telling yourself about this person's situation, and how does that story affect you? Does it leave you feeling scared or hopeless or disempowered? Or does it leave you feeling hopeful and determined? What might be a more empowering story to tell yourself about this situation and this person? So in the Sam situation, one of the things that I told myself to change my story, I'll share a couple things. Number one is, I have no idea why he did this. It seemed like an overt, obvious act of hostility, but I don't know. Maybe maybe he hasn't matured past middle school and he really thinks that's a funny thing. I don't know. I also kept reminding myself to create a more empowering story that if I bring this up and it goes well, it can have a hugely positive impact, not just on my life, but also the reverberation throughout the organization, because I wasn't the only one that Sam was acting this way toward. And so one of my beliefs, and what oftentimes gives me the courage to have these kinds of conversations when I don't want to, is if nobody ever speaks up, nothing ever changes. What might be a more empowering story to tell yourself about this conversation? So that was what I started telling myself about having the conversation. What I also tell myself in these kind of conversations is each time I have these hard conversations, it builds my skill. Remember that virtuous cycle? It builds my skill level so it becomes easier and easier. Okay, so here's what I want to ask you to do. Back to your trusty partner or triad. Let's do about 5 or 6 minutes where you share what story do you tell yourself about this person. Well, you can just use these questions. Do you tell yourself, and then what might be a more empowering story? Okay, so you can use these questions as a guideline. Okay? So 5 or 6 minutes, and then I'll give you a 30-second warning.
Oh, that's okay.
Thank you. Give yourselves a hand now. Okay, so any questions about the challenging your story piece? Any questions? So no questions about story? Well, let's move on to your state. One of the most important life skills is the life skill of managing our emotional state. Those of you who are hip to emotional intelligence know that's a component of emotional intelligence. It was interesting, just the other day I was listening to a webinar where the speaker said, and she was talking about managing your emotional state. And she said, I remember years ago listening to a vintage Tony Robbins audio cassette. So this is back in the day when he was in his 20s. And it was when he did his first personal power program. And she said it was really wild because it was sort of like an outtake of the session where he was just being almost like off mic, except they were recording it. The interviewer asked him about in his opinion, what's the most important skill for achieving peak performance? And she said he pounds the table and he goes, managing your state. It's like, all right, Tony, I gotcha. And it's something that elite athletes know. Any of you, if you do any sort of performance, whether it's an artistic performance or athletic activity or competition, you know the importance of being in a high performance state. And back to what I mentioned before in terms of emotional contagion. How many of you know about mirror neurons? I'm sure some of you do. Oh, okay. So if you want to Google mirror neurons, so like mirror on the wall, mirror neurons, they're in this part of the brain, the frontal lobe, and their job is to help you empathize with other people, get a sense of what's going on inside of them. And what the mirror neurons do is, so let's say Denise is angry with me because I dropped the ball on things and I'm totally clueless about it. And she wants to have a conversation with me and she's seething with anger. Okay? And she's trying to not look that way, but it's coming through. What happens, my mirror neurons lock onto her face and they pick up the nonverbal cues of seething anger, and they start to create in me, start firing off the neural impulses to create the same emotional state in me that's going on in her. Mirror neurons. So that's Dan Goleman, author, one of the leaders in emotional intelligence, calls it emotional Wi-Fi. Isn't that great? So these mirror neurons are a major conduit for emotional contagion. So that's why we need to get our stories right so that we can help get our state right so we can enter the conversation in a productive emotional and mental state. So how do we get our state right? So number one, we work on creating a more useful story. And here's a saying that I love, I heard years ago, that get curious, not furious. Isn't that great? Get curious, not furious. We can't be curious and furious at the same time. It doesn't happen. And so one of the things that really helps me get into a productive state if I'm feeling angry or hurt or whatever is to start getting curious. So in the, quote, Sam situation, I started shifting from like, who does he think he is and blah, 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 into what would be a productive way to bring up this issue? How might I bring it up in a way that Sam will be receptive and not immediately defensive and combative and antagonistic? So that's a nice mantra to help us shift state, to get curious, not furious. What else can we do? Notice and stop endless loop arguments in your head. Have you ever noticed that? That you just play out this argument, that how you anticipate it's going to be, over and over and over. And it's like we end up having like 47 arguments with them, and we haven't even talked yet. So we've created this horrible history with them, and it's all in our head. So challenging those endless loop arguments. Number two, vent to a friend or your coach, then ask for their perspective. It's so important for us to discharge that negative energy, that negative emotion. And sometimes we can't do it on our own. We need to do that with somebody else. We don't want to discharge it, even though maybe we secretly do want to discharge it and let the person have it. Like, I really wanted to blast Sam. But how useful is that? And one of the things that I like to remind people is, I need to have that conversation right now to get it off my chest. That's the least useful reason to have the conversation now. That we don't want to discharge on the person. Okay? Also, because of the mind-body connection, our ability to think rationally is directly related to our emotional state. So we can't see it productively and rationally, the situation, when we're in that state. So whatever we need to do first to discharge that emotion. And sometimes, and I'm sure you can relate to it, sometimes if we're upset, we immediately want our friend or coach or mentor to reality test with us or give them us suggestions. Other times we're so upset, we just want to hold that advice for now. Okay, hold that advice for now. I just need to get this off my chest. And then, once I'm in a better state, then I'm up for your advice. So one of the things that we can take responsibility is asking for what we need. Not into your 5-point plan right now. I just want to talk this out first. Unless you are ready for their 5-point plan. Ask, this is one of my favorite questions. What action on my part is for the highest good? What action on my part is for the highest good? So even if I can't get myself into a state of liking this person or even having compassion for them, sometimes it's just, I just can't get there because they're, and for me at least, so unlikable, and what they did was just so egregious. I can't get there. Most of the time I can, but sometimes I can. So especially in those situations, I pull out the big guns, and it's like, what's for the highest good here? And back to what I said earlier, that one of the best ways we can make a difference in the world is to show up in these courageous conversations as our best possible selves and role model that for others. To role model, you can talk about difficult things. You can talk about situations where you're really upset without being disrespectful, without being confrontational. So that's your state. Now, just one comment, and then, yes, we'll get to it. Yeah. You'll get a lot more resources with nitty-gritty tools for changing your state, for those of you who want that. So there's more than just what's in your handout. Okay.
Just curious, can you share advice on choosing time and place?
Okay, so thank you for question. Yes, love a question. So choosing time or place. One thing related to time, whether it's you're upset or the other person's upset, sometimes nothing other than time will enable you or the other person to shift into a more positive emotional state. Our physiology has just been shifted so strongly when we're really upset that nothing but time will allow our nervous system to reset and the biochemicals of fight or flight to metabolize. So that's one of that's one of the reasons why it took me all these years to realize having delayed intelligence has actually been a gift, because instead of snapping back from that antagonistic Neanderthal state, I was able to do all the work that we're talking about, and I could bring my higher self into that situation and bring out the higher self in the other person. Does that answer? And also, actually, the story about Sam also speaks to place. So one of the other sort of bigger picture responses to your question, I try to think about when is the best time to have this so the other person doesn't feel rushed or pressured. So that's where that thoughtfulness comes in. So let's say you're coaching an employee to bring up something with their boss, not at the end of the day or like Friday afternoon. Is that any? Okay, thank you. Okay. Any other questions before we move from state? So you'll get a lot more on shifting state, including techniques like challenging mind reading, challenging fortune telling, challenging catastrophizing, etc. Now, the next step is examining, why do we even want to have this conversation? What's my intention? What's my intention? So, what's your intention, and why is having the right intention so important? Because if we have a destructive intention, obviously things aren't going to go well. So let me share with you, and these questions are in the handout that come with the presentation. Let me share some questions for you to think about. And again, if you can be thinking about that one conversation, or if you had multiple conversations. Is my intention to show them that they are wrong and I am right? And you think about how much we love it when somebody tries to show us we're wrong and they're right. And even if you're dead, like in that situation, I felt like I was in the right and he was in the wrong. And so I wanted him to see the wrongness of it all. And yet, how useful will that be? Is my intention to make them feel bad about themselves? That was my initial intention. I wanted him to feel bad about himself. I wanted him to squirm just as much as I squirmed in that meeting. So think about, as you fantasize having your conversation, or maybe when you think about the fantasies you've had in the past, has it been to punish that person, to make them squirm? Am I trying to get them to be someone different than they are? Thank you. And here's a really important distinction. You know, people say, the only person you can change is yourself. You can't change anybody else. Well, yeah. And that's just part of the story. We can influence other people. We can't control them. We can't force them to change. But we can certainly influence people. And this is one of the things. How many of you ever read the book Influencer? Yeah, isn't it awesome? It's one of my all-time favorite books. It's by the same team, the Vital Smarts team, the same team who wrote Crucial Conversations. And of their books, The Influencer is my favorite book of theirs. And one of the things that I loved, you know how when somebody says something you agree with, you're like, man, they're smart. You know, because in there, I'm like, man, they're smart. Because they talked about how in our culture, there's so much emphasis on, oh, you can't change other people, that people are forgetting the fact that we have the power of influence. And a really important part of being an effective person, whether it's an HR leader, whether it's a supervisor, whether it's a parent, whether it's a person in your community, is your ability to influence people for the good. So we do want to think about, what would I like to influence in this other person? So with Sam, what I wanted to influence, number one, is for him to never do that again to me. I also really hoped that he would never do it to anybody else. I didn't just want me to be the beneficiary of that. I also, in the conversation, I was really mindful of, I wanted to influence his ability to hear me without getting defensive. So when we get to the verbiage part, I was really put a lot of energy and thought into, how do I bring this up so I can influence him in a positive way so he can hear this and not feel threatened and become antagonistic. Am I expecting something from them that they probably don't have the capacity to give? And we don't know that because I've been surprised over the years. People that I didn't think had the maturity level to rise to the occasion and relate at the level I wanted, because I did all the hard work, change my story, change my state, got clear on my intention, and then came up with a productive way of bringing it up. Because I did all the hard work, they rose to a level I didn't expect would be possible. So we don't want to write somebody off, but we also want to be realistic. Am I asking them for a level of maturity that maybe they don't possess? It's kind of like this. This just kind of flashed in my mind. Back to my daughter, Jessie. I remember when she was really little, I didn't want her to eat berries, because, poisonous berries. Also, though, some berries are, like blueberries, are fine, but there was no way I wanted to try to get into the nuances of healthy berry selection. Like, don't do this one, but this one's good. See the petal, she's like 2 years old. So it had to be like simple black or white. Don't eat berries, period. And then once she got developmentally to the level where we could talk about discernment, then we could do a little more fine-tuning. So it's the same thing when you're gauging that person, gauging their developmental level, the maturity level, and what do you think is possible for them? Because we don't want to put somebody into a situation where we're asking from them something that they're not able to give, and then because of that, they do what's called downshifting. And I'll tell you the Super Reader's Digest condensed version, and there's a video that you'll get that goes into more detail. But the super condensed Reader's Digest version is downshifting is when somebody feels threatened, they feel stressed out or overwhelmed or unfairly accused. What happens is, instead of the prefrontal lobe, the super advanced smart part of your brain, instead of that running the show, it gets pushed aside by the reptilian brain, this primitive brain region, which is the repository of hardwired, like caveman and cavewoman, survival of the strongest and the fittest programs. And road rage is a perfect example of like extreme downshifting. And so if a person feels threatened and they downshift, it's like trying to have a reasonable conversation with a Neanderthal if they downshift a whole lot. Okay? So that's why we want to be really careful about doing all this work and then having verbiage which comes across as respectful and open-minded. So these are questions for you to be thinking about related to your intention. So here's what I want to ask you to do. On your own, for like 1 minute, just kind of jot down some thoughts about what your intention maybe was with the conversation that you've been working with this morning, and how you might change that intention if you realize it wasn't such a great intention. If it already was a great intention, then way to go. So we'll do a minute.
So in this next section, you will hear an example brought up by one of the audience participants, although you won't actually hear his words. I edited them out because I didn't get permission to include his recording in this. So when you hear the silence, that's the part when he's sharing what he's saying, but you'll hear me repeat to the audience his points.
So we've got an awesome question from one of your colleagues. So go ahead.
What that?
And so,
let me give you a little context.
Yeah, please do. Yes, okay. So somebody incredibly bright and possibly narcissistic. And I'm going to just ask you questions, and feel free to say I decline to answer any, what are you wanting from them that you don't think they're capable of delivering?
Yeah.
Okay. And another question, have you had those conversations with that person? Okay. Okay, so here are some thoughts about that. So thank you. Appreciate that. So some thoughts about that. So if you've had a conversation and it didn't go well, that's where I think it's so important to be conscious of what's the takeaway message you create for yourself about the fact that it didn't go well. Like, what's the story you tell yourself about it? Because maybe, and this was the supervisor who had the conversation, maybe they didn't have the conversation in a way that was very productive. So let's say you've tried it in the past, it hasn't worked well. That's where you want to process it with somebody to find out, well, this is how I brought it up, this is how I responded. Did that help create a negative situation? So you want to make sure that we don't just dismiss, there's nothing I can do because I tried it before. Oftentimes, what we tried before wasn't really top notch. So that's one point. Sort of the flip side of that, though, is one of the things about constructive conversations, courageous conversations, is you can't win them all. You can have textbook perfect verbiage. Your heart can be in the right place. You could be ideal state, and still it crashes and burns. So it's not obviously a guarantee that everything will work well. Also, there's another point that's really important, for me at least, and that's, actually, let me tell you a quick story. I was listening to this interview by this guy who's really famous in the social media world, and the interviewer was asking him, how does he deal with like Twitter trolls? So people were posting like really hateful stuff. And this guy goes, like, I basically, I ignore them. He goes, well, what do you think about what I hear some people say, why don't you win them over, like kill them with kindness? And I love what this guy said. He said, like, okay, if they want to do that, that's fine. He said, but I didn't sign up to be a jackass whisperer. And I love that. And I really think that really has to play out in the workplace. That, and this is where the courageous part really comes into play, is that we need to make sure that person shoulders their responsibility and their accountability. Because if there's no consequence for being, rude, disrespectful, or a lousy supervisor, and they're not interested in changing, then nothing's going to change. You can't make somebody want to change. And so one of the things I found over the years in working with managers is oftentimes they're looking for the ideal conversation to turn this person around, when really what the conversation needs to be is about freeing up that person's future. That's what the conversation needs to be. And that's where the courage, again, needs to come in. So that's how I come down on that. Okay, thanks. All right, any other questions about... Oh, one last one. What outcome would I like from this conversation, and is it possible, reasonable, and truly desirable? So for my example with good old Sam, I actually shared with you the outcome, that he doesn't treat me this way, that he doesn't treat other people that way, and that in the conversation. So when I think about outcome, I think about what do I want to happen in the conversation, and then what do I want to have happen as a result. Any other questions about intention? Okay. So last but not least is your verbiage. Speaking your truth without blame or judgment. This comes from Dr. Angeles Arians, an anthropologist who studied indigenous cultures and the wisdom of indigenous cultures. And she wrote a book called The Fourfold Way. And one of the four is speak your truth without blame or judgment. So share, this is what happened for me when this happened. This is what I would like. This is my experience of what happened. As opposed to, you were unprofessional, you were bad. Speak your truth, and that can be really hard to do, especially when you're really upset. Non-attachment to outcome. This is a huge. So this is one of the other of the fourfold ways, to not be attached to outcome. And what I mean by that is not expect. So in the Sam situation, not demanding in my mind that Sam respond the way I want him to. I want him to do that, obviously, or I wouldn't have the conversation. But not predicate my happiness or my serenity on Sam following the part that I've created for him. Okay? That being said, if Sam did respond in a way that was not okay with me, like if he said, don't be so sensitive, that's just how I roll, that wasn't my cue to be like, oh, okay, sorry. Like, no, that was not an option in my mind. So that's where we don't want to catastrophize and imagine some horrible thing to happen and then get all upset about it. But remember I said we do want to sort of war game. And so I did think about, if Sam does say that, this is what my next response will be. And it would be something like, maybe you think it's okay, but it's not okay with me. If you do it again, we're getting together with, let's say, Sue, our boss, and we're going to talk about it. So there was definitely a round two if he blew me off. That being said, a quick behind the scenes. I had shared with a colleague of mine who had kind of taken me under her wing, because, again, I was a newbie in the organization, about what had happened with Sam. And she's like, oh, yeah, Sam's done that to me a bunch of times. And I said, I'm thinking of bringing it up to Sue. She basically says, good luck with that. Because when I brought it up to Sue, Sue said, oh, that's just Sam being Sam. So that unwillingness to challenge toxic behavior. So I had a plan for that too, like what I was going to do if she said that to me. So we do want to have contingency plans. But non-attachment to outcome is like, it has to be this, they have to respond, or else it's going to ruin my day. Balancing courage, clarity, and kindness. Sometimes I found over the years, especially if it's like old school managers, they tend to think that engaging people in constructive conversations and being thoughtful about how can I be respectful they mistake it for sugarcoating. It's like, no, it's not sugarcoating. It's being direct and being kind and respectful. So for each, one of the things that I think about is if you were to be really simplistic and divide people into two camps. One camp is people who are great with the courage. They're just not so great with the kindness. Okay? And so if that sounds like you, if you're really great with being direct, but sometimes you kind of hit people between the eyes, then working on the kindness part is your growing edge. If you're really good with the kindness, but the courage is the challenge, then working on the courage part, working on making sure I'm really clear about what the issue is, and I don't sugarcoat it, I don't minimize it. So these are some guiding principles, and again, there'll be more in the follow-up material. So to try to keep things simple over the years, I've come up with this little memory device, the declaration invitation. So 2 steps, it rhymes obviously. So the declaration is you declare, hey, this is what I want to talk about. This is what I want to talk about. And then the invitation is, hey, let's talk. So the first one is broadcast, and then the second one is invite, receive. Okay? Broadcast out, and then invite them, and then receiving what they have to say. Okay? Declaration, invitation. Whoops. Okay. So we'll get to him later. So here's what I want to ask you to do. Last exercise in your trusty groups. So it's showtime. I do all kinds of work that day. I do lots of venting with my best friend to get out of that state. I work on getting curious, not furious. I think about my declaration invitation. How can I bring this up in a way that will foster an open conversation and get my point across? What about my plan B, plan C? If it all goes awry, what do I do? Okay? Next day, bright and early, I get there. And this gets back to the question about time and place. That we were in a cubicle environment, or Sam was in a cubicle. And he's there, and I see him. And I don't want to turn this into a gladiator event, especially if he's the lion and I'm, And so, words matter. Now, I said, hey, Sam, can I talk with you about something? Okay? Now, I just said, hey, Sam, can I talk with you about something? Now, because we didn't have any overt history of conflict, I felt comfortable saying that. But if we had a history of bad blood, would that have been a good thing to say? No. Instantly, what would happen with Sam? You'd instantly get defensive, like, okay, now what? So if that situation, I might have just said, hey, Sam, can I run something by you? I'd be interested in your take on it. Very neutral, and it was true. I wanted to run by the situation and get the take, like, where the heck were you coming from? Okay, he's like, sure, cool. So like, hey, can we meet over there? So we meet in an office, so again, it wouldn't be a gladiator event. Okay, so here's what I want to ask you to do. So now Sam and I are face to face. What's the declaration? Invitation. So with your trusty groups, we'll do 5 minutes. See how far you can get. So I want you to be like super crisp and like on track. How would you bring it up? We're face to face. It's showtime. My scenario. So you're me, Sam's across from you. How do you bring it up? 5 minutes. Okay. Hey, thanks for being so responsive. I appreciate that. So let's do like 1 or 2 declaration invitations, and then I'll share with you what I said. Now, no theorizing, no setup. Just say, this is what we came up with. Like Sam's in front of me and you're me, and then you say it. Yes?
That's a tough act to follow.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll tell you what I said. Okay. So remember, speak your truth without blame or judgment. Declaration, invitation. So here we go. So I said, hey, Sam, I don't know if you remember yesterday, I don't know if you remember in yesterday's meeting when you said, and then I repeated what he said. So let's say it was like when you said, your idea stinks and so do you. I said, I'm sure you were just trying to be funny. Now, not so, I wasn't sure, but I'm trying to give the person the benefit of the doubt. You think about, we like it when people give us the benefit of the doubt. So trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. So I'm sure you were just trying to be funny, but being on the receiving end of it, it didn't feel real funny. So notice what I did. It didn't feel real funny. I shared my experience of it. I didn't label him as being unprofessional or a bully or any of that, even though I was thinking those things. I simply shared my experience. Also, you might notice it didn't feel funny. I didn't say it hurt my feelings, because it didn't. It made me mad. I felt mad. If it had hurt my feelings, I wouldn't have shared it with him. Why?
He sees your weakness.
Because given his track record, maybe that's what he was looking for. He sees the weakness and now he's going to go for it with gusto. So if he were a friend, I would have said, that really hurt that you said that. Like, what was up with that? I would have been that vulnerable. But given his track record, no. Again, though, I shared my experience, but in a fairly protected way. So it didn't feel funny. And then my invitation was kind of lame. It was just sort of like, so I was wondering what was up with that, or where were you coming from? Nothing fancy. So I'll say it again. I don't know if you remember yesterday in the meeting when you said your idea stinks and so do you. I'm sure you're just trying to be. Oh, let me ask you, why did I repeat what he said?
Accountability.
So accountability, Carol says, clarity.
So you're both starting from the same page.
So we're starting from the same page. Let's say if I just started saying like, Sam, you know how important it is for us to treat each other with respect in meetings? And Sam's like, what are you talking about? Yeah. Or if I just said, in yesterday's meeting when you were a jerk, that would have really started off right. So you want hearing what you actually said externally when somebody else says it to you, and also it's like, oh, when you hear your words repeated back, it can have an impact. So that's why I said that. And also I want to be super clear. Remember, we want to be clear about what I'm talking about. So I'm sure you're just trying to be funny, but being on the receiving end of it, it didn't feel real funny. So I was wondering where you were coming from, what was up with that. This is his response. Wow, I don't even remember saying that. And later, I found myself thinking, what a perfect example of, that saying, it's better to assume ignorance than evil intent? A lot of times, thoughtless behavior and thoughtless things people say are literally that, less any thought. They weren't thinking, they just said stuff. So he goes, wow, I don't even remember saying that. And then he goes, and then he pauses again, he goes, man, thanks for letting me know. I would hate to think I was saying things that were offending people. Really? And then if that's not enough of a shocker, then he goes, he has even a bigger epiphany. He goes, man, yeah. He goes, thanks for telling me, because I really pride myself on my professionalism. Really? Hopefully, I don't have a good poker face. Hopefully, And so, and I'm stunned but happy at his response. And I don't remember what happened after that, but I do remember two things, and really important things. Number one, that reptilian brain my reptilian brain, it's so weird because remember I said it's hardwired for caveman, cavewoman days? And so part of that hardwired programming is all about power and control. So people that you deal with that are power-hungry maniacs and control freaks, they're operating out of their reptilian brain big time. And so what was so weird was one of the aspects of power and control is like dominance hierarchy. And I found what happened because in the original situation, I felt like in the submissive role, and suddenly I'm in the dominant role, like he's being contrite. And it was sort of like the foe is on the ground, like put your foot on his throat, like do the killing strike. And what that translated into me, though, was not to like badger him or bludgeon him with judgment, but then the part of me that really wants to make the world a better place, I wanted to launch into like, well, Sam, I've seen you do that with other people. You know what I'm saying? And I really, like, now that I've got him down, like, really, and I'm like, down boy, don't go there. Can you imagine? It would have totally destroyed everything. So I was able to keep a lid on my own reptilian brain rising up and the desire to make the world a better place. But the other thing that I also, and this is from a previous career as a counselor and counseling men, this is a generalization, but oftentimes I find that men are not as into talking about their feelings. Women, I know that comes as a surprise. And so if it was a friend of mine, I'd want to talk more about like the relationship stuff and all that. What would happen if I started... Sam was in IT. So what would have happened if I talk about like relationships and, all that good work right out the window? So I was really cognizant of the fact, get out of Dodge ASAP. So I quickly like wrapped up like, hey man, appreciate your being willing to talk about this. Like, no, I appreciate you bringing this up. And then got out of Dodge.
Did anything change?
Yep. Never did it again.
You or him?
Ever. Ever. He never did that to me or anybody else, at least that I witnessed. And I love sharing that story. Talk about wind up with next steps. I love sharing that story because there's some powerful lessons. Number one, if I hadn't done all the hard work to get to that place, it would have been a disaster. Especially if, like, right after the meeting, I couldn't like restrain myself and went at him in an antagonistic way. Number one. So doing the hard work is worth it. Number two, even people that you don't think can rise to the occasion. I wouldn't have put money on Sam having that kind of response. Even people you don't think can rise to the occasion can. And number three, the difference you can make if you're willing to have the conversation is huge. And so next steps, read the conference materials. Use the plethora of articles and recording, that's such a fun word, that I'll be sending you. I would go through, and again, the conference handouts walks you through half the questions with a wise friend, colleague, or coach. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I love this. And also, I'm working on a book on courageous conversations at work. So if you have a courageous conversation that you've had, that you want to share with me, or that you're struggling with, I would love to hear from you and interview you. So remember, every better result you want requires a better conversation, and maybe most importantly, you can help make the world a better place, one courageous conversation at a time. Thank you very much.